Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be, and welcome to the 5th annual Future of Speech Online event. My name is Emma Alonso, and I'm the director of the Free Expression Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology, and I will be your MC for this year's event. We have a great 3 days of programming planned for you this year, all focused around the theme of making transparency meaningful. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. As we grapple with difficult questions of online content governance and platform accountability, everything from fighting disinformation and hate speech online, to combating terrorist abuse of online services while respecting human rights, to enabling individuals to make choices about the sites and services that they use, it's very common to reach for transparency as a key tool in the policy toolbox. But as with any big idea in policy conversations, the more that people talk about it, the less that it can be clear exactly what we're talking about. So over the next 3 days, we'll hear from a variety of different speakers and experts on different aspects of transparency, and hear some different ideas about what different forms of transparency can really help us achieve in terms of broader goals of empowering people and holding online services and governments accountable for how they affect people's human rights. Now, before we dive in, just a few housekeeping notes. This event is being live streamed and recorded and will be accessible via CDT's YouTube page. We'll also be dropping links to the YouTube live stream in the chat. Anyone who has questions for the organizers or trouble with any of the Zoom features or any other technical issues, you can contact events@cdt.org. And during our panel discussions, folks are welcome to submit questions via Zoom's Q&A feature or by email to questions@cdt.org or on Twitter using the hashtag CDTquestions. Now for today's agenda, we have a lot of great speakers for you. Our first panel, What Do We Mean by Transparency, will run to just past the hour. Then we'll have a very short break as we change over our speakers and then move on to our second session of the day, Empowering Users Through Transparency. That will run to the very end of our second hour of programming today. That second panel will be right here at the same link that you used to join this first session. So if you're planning to attend both, just sit tight when the first panel concludes and the second will start shortly. And then finally, I'd really like to give a big thank you to our partners for this event, the Charles Koch Institute. CKI has sponsored the Future of Speech Online ever since our first event in 2017, and CDT is really grateful for all of the support and partnership from CKI over the years. And now I'm delighted to introduce today's opening speaker, Neil Chilson, who's the Senior Research Fellow for Technology and Innovation at the Charles Koch Institute. Neil, take it away.
Thanks so much, Emma. It's great to be back here at FOSO. First, a little bit about the Charles Koch Institute. We partner with social entrepreneurs like CDT who explore how to break barriers so that each and every individual can realize their unique potential. We do this through grant making, convening, and education, and events like today's. In pursuit of that mission, we're thrilled to continue our partnership with the Center for Democracy and Technology and to support this year's Future of Speech Online. As Emma mentioned, the theme this year is workable transparency, and this topic couldn't be more timely. Emma mentioned that everybody's talking about transparency, and when it comes to speech online, why is talk about transparency so appealing? I think politically, we can easily understand the appeal. One of the big challenges with the policies surrounding speech online is that people fundamentally can't agree on what they want the companies to do. In many cases, it comes down to more fancy versions of leave up speech that I like and take down speech that I don't like. And in a nation that is focused on polarization, these likes and dislikes can often conflict. With that kind of political impasse, transparency appears to offer a path to doing something, because regardless of what the companies do, many people agree that the companies should at least be transparent about what they do. And we've seen legislative proposals in that vein. But as Emma mentioned, and I think as the many panels and experts who are going to be talking about at this event are going to illustrate, like all things in speech, transparency is complex. There are significant practical challenges with transparency. What kinds of transparency? What information should be shared? Who should it be shared with? And what companies should practice it? I believe these and many other questions stem from a fundamental challenge that applies anytime an outsider seeks to understand and govern a system. Using transparency to improve our understanding of social media platforms with the goal of improving the governance of those platforms is a version of what Yale anthropologist James C. Scott called legibility. The inner workings of a complex system are illegible, they're unreadable, they're non-transparent to people who are trying to govern that system. And so they engage in efforts to make the system legible, to make it transparent. And the effects of such efforts differ greatly depending on the type of system. And I'd like to offer a set of two different types of systems that we should ask whether social media platforms are like, and that's forests and factories. Starting with factories. In the early 20th century, Fred Taylor sought to transform how factories were operated. He wanted to impose legibility. He wanted to make the smallest activities within a factory transparent to management, who could then measure and adjust those activities to serve the single purpose of the factory, which is the maximization of efficient output. This scientific approach to management, which came to be known as Taylorism, resulted in factories with strict goals, routines, and measurements. And these measures improved transparency and often did improve productivity significantly. Although Taylorism had its limits, particularly when it treated humans as essentially machines who were doing very repetitive tasks, and it struggled to keep up in more creative or dynamic industries. Still, transparency within the factory did tend to advance the single purposes of the factory. Now let's compare the factory to the forest. Back to James C. Scott, he tells the story of early German forestry. In the late 18th century, Prussian and Saxon kingdoms viewed their wild, complex forests with a very narrow lens. They saw them as revenue producers through timber. But the forests, of course, had many different purposes, including to the common people who used the mix of many different trees and the abundant non-lumber producing plant and animal life for medicine, hunting, even firewood. But the mix, these many different trees, these complex wild forests were largely non-transparent to the rulers. They were illegible, to use Scott's language. And to increase the transparency and the legibility of the forest, the rulers started with surveys to help them understand the number of lumber producing trees. Then they formed complex formulas and tables to estimate the constant lumber yield of the forest. This is a very scientific approach to forestry, and it was groundbreaking at the time. But with this focus on a single purpose, the production of lumber, the next logical step was to shape the forest in the direction that served that single purpose. So now that we could measure lumber output, forestry management turned into moving the forest towards that purpose. And the end result, which came in just a few decades later, was a forest that was transformed from a wild, diverse ecosystem to a very orderly, aesthetically pleasing monoculture of lumber-producing trees that served the ruler's purpose as well. It was easy to measure, it was easy to harvest for timber, but it fundamentally eliminated many of the other uses of the forest by others, such as sources for the common people, as I already mentioned, of medicine, hunting, and firewood. In the short term, this rationalized forest greatly increased lumber yield. It served the purposes of the kingdom. But ironically, in the longer run, due to the ecosystem disruption, the monoculture forest actually was more vulnerable to disease and lumber production dropped significantly. And German forestry since then has been a series of patches and approaches to try to accommodate the goals of lumber production while keeping the benefits of a dynamic, complex ecosystem. Social media platforms have parts that look like forests and they have parts that look like factories. And I think to make transparency workable, we'll have to identify those parts that are like factories and those that are like forests. My thesis, and I think we'll be exploring this throughout the rest of the agenda, is that increasing transparency for the factory-like portions of social media will be straightforward, although not necessarily simple. And will tend to have fewer side effects that are unintended because those systems can be understood better. But increasing transparency of the forest-like portions, the portions that serve many different purposes, will be very difficult and are likely, if transparency is successful in this space to the purposes of the regulators, it may neglect or potentially degrade the usefulness of the platforms for other people's purposes. And as already mentioned, it's not even clear that regulators have a single purpose in this. And so these forest-like portions, I think, are going to be the real challenge and the part of social media governance and where transparency will face a lot of difficulties. So I think the program that's coming up is extremely well positioned to dig deep into this really difficult challenge. And I'm very glad, CKI is very glad to support CDT in this effort. I'm really glad that you as the audience are here to join us in this effort towards workable transparency. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Neil. Those are some really great metaphors for us to be thinking about over the discussions that we have in the next few days. Now we are going to begin our first panel discussion on that key question of what do we mean by transparency. So my speakers for panel one are welcome to turn on their video and come kind of join us on the virtual stage. Now, as a little bit of background on this question of what do we mean by transparency, at CDT, we have long been advocates for various forms of transparency, whether it's advocating with companies to ask them to provide regular information and reporting about the demands that they get from governments around the world for access to user data or for restricting content online. We helped to found the Global Network Initiative back in 2008, 2009, as a way to actually begin enabling a multi-stakeholder group to conduct assessments of information, including very private, confidential information from companies, to really try to evaluate what impact were they having on users' rights worldwide. And we've also done things like work with other nonprofit organizations to launch the Santa Clara principles on accountability and transparency in content moderation, including a revision of the principles that was just launched at the Internet Governance Forum last week. Transparency is a really big issue. It's core to our heart here at CDT, and it's also increasingly part of the public policy discussions around online content governance. We see proposals in the United States, proposals in the European Union, laws being passed into practice in countries around the world. And as we think about kind of what is going to happen with transparency in the tech policy field, at CDT, we think it's important to really try to be clear about what we mean when we talk about that. So today we've actually published a framework for policymakers with the same title as this event series, Making Transparency Meaningful, that covers kind of 4 key areas that we see in transparency policy. That includes transparency reports, those sort of regular reporting out from companies about kind of their practices and their policies and how they respond to government demands in particular. Things like user-focused notice. What are the content policies, the terms and conditions, the information that users get when their content or accounts are restricted? What can they actually know about what's happening to their speech on different platforms? A third category of transparency is assessments or audits or other analysis of company practice. And then the fourth topic, and one that's been getting a lot of attention lately, is this whole question of researcher access to data, and how do you enable researchers to gain access to data held by social media companies and other kinds of tech companies so that they can perform independent research on what is going on these services. We'll share a link in the chat to the framework that we've laid out, but our goal there is really to kind of articulate the state of play for some of these different areas and highlight key questions that each of these kinds of transparency is aimed to answer, and to help policymakers consider what are the trade-offs for each of these issues. If you answer a question in a certain way, what are really the kind of pros and cons of that and the consequences? So in all of the conversations that we're having during this event, we're going to hopefully dig into a lot of those key questions. What sorts of transparency are we talking about? What problems are we trying to solve? Who is our audience for this kind of transparency? And many more. This can all sound kind of abstract, but I promise you we will get concrete. And to help me do that, for our first panel, we are joined by four very distinguished speakers who I'll introduce right now and then turn the floor over to them. So first, we'll be hearing from Rebecca Mckinnon, who is the Vice President for Global Advocacy at the Wikimedia Foundation. Rebecca has a storied career in human rights and internet policy advocacy, having launched many initiatives founded or focused on users' rights and corporate accountability, including being a co-founder of the Global Network Initiative and of the citizen media network Global Voices, and also being the founding director of the Ranking Digital Rights Project. Clara Frederick, our second speaker, is a research fellow in technology policy at the Heritage Foundation. Cara's research focuses on big tech and emerging technology policy, and among her many previous roles, she helped create and lead Facebook's Global Security Counterterrorism Analysis Program. Then we'll hear from Dunstan Allison Hope, the Vice President at Business for Social Responsibility, where he has worked for nearly 18 years on issues of human rights and corporate responsibility, including conducting human rights impact assessments with major tech companies, helping to develop standards for reporting in different industries, and helping facilitate the launch of the Global Network Initiative. And then finally, we have Rebecca Tromble, who's Associate Professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University, where she is also the Director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics. In addition to leading research projects, including investigating how to measure the quality of online news content and the health of online conversations, Rebecca has also been deeply involved in the policy discussions around how to better enable independent researchers to have access to data held by private companies. So as you can see, we have a wealth of expertise here to help us really unpack all of these different kinds of transparency. First, I think I'll turn to Rebecca Mckinnon. So Rebecca, as we've been laying out so far in the session, transparency is a really hot topic in 2021. Looks like it will continue to be the same in 2022. But you've been advocating for increased transparency from technology companies for many, many years. Can you tell us a little bit about how this issue of transparency in the tech sector has developed over the years?
Sure. Thanks so much, Emma, and I'm just thrilled to be here with this particular group of panelists today. So I've been calling for transparency in various roles really since 2005, and working with activists and researchers on this question. And the discussion about transparency that I was involved with initially was really spurred by debates and reactions to the entry of a number of US tech companies to China, one of the most repressive internet environments in the world. In 2004, 2005, Yahoo came under fire for having handed over email information about dissidents and journalists to the Chinese authorities, resulting in people being jailed. Google was under fire for going into China and agreeing to a censored search engine to remove search results. And Microsoft was also being criticized for deleting bloggers' content, bloggers' writings on a blogging platform that they had at the time that they were offering in China in response to sort of phone calls from authorities. And so there were a number of congressional hearings, and there was a lot of discourse around this at the time. Should these companies be in China? And if so, under what circumstances? And you mentioned the Global Network Initiative. There were a number of conversations that started around that time about what are some core principles that companies that are operating in challenging environments like China need to adhere to in order to respect and protect their users' rights. And that, of course, led to a broader conversation, not just about China, but about the fact that a lot of governments are making demands of companies to either remove content or hand over user data in ways that violate people's human rights to freedom of expression and privacy. And what are companies' obligations? And a very core element that everyone agreed on was transparency. People need to understand who is manipulating their information environment, who is manipulating what they can and cannot know, what they can and cannot say, under what authority, for what reason. Otherwise, you don't know what you don't know. In the case of search results being removed in China, if you don't know that some results have been removed on government request, then you don't even realize you're being censored. And that's the most insidious thing. Similarly, if you don't know what authorities have access to your data under what circumstances, you can't protect yourself. You can't make informed decisions about how to use the service. So the point being, there was, of course, a debate about whether companies should be in environments like China at all. But if they are, how can you be how do you make sure that your users understand what risks they face when using your services, so that they can make informed decisions, and also understand how their information environment is being manipulated, whether it's by government censorship or by other actors, so that they, again, can understand whether they have a full picture or not, so that they can then, if they want to, take action to find information elsewhere, so that they're not living in a bubble, not even realizing it. So that was kind of the basic principle, that in order for people to have agency and exercise their rights, they need to understand how power is being exercised over their information and over their access to their data and information about them. So when as the discussions that led to the formation of the Global Network Initiative proceeded, one of the core principles was transparency and the obligation of companies, and the need to commit to be as transparent with users as possible, not only about government demands, but also about their processes for dealing with various external demands that would affect users' privacy and freedom of expression. And so what that led to, in 2010, Google released its first transparency report with actual data. Before that, we weren't actually calling for transparency reports because we hadn't conceived of the thing. Google created the thing known as a transparency report that created that standard in terms of data about government demands and so on. And I went back and looked at some things I wrote around 10 years ago. As of 2012, so starting in 2010, Google released its first transparency report, started doing them on a regular basis. By 2012, we had Twitter, LinkedIn, Dropbox, and the internet service provider Sonic.net were the only companies issuing transparency reports. And some of us were calling, and also Wikimedia actually started issuing a transparency report around 2012, 2013, starting with 2012 data. So those were the early days. And other companies, many of us were calling on other companies to issue transparency reports. Just you can come up with the list of some of the big name companies we were bothering about their need to do this, and there was a lot of pushback about, well, it's not clear whether it's useful or serves a real purpose or whatever. And then 2013, the Snowden revelations happened, and all of a sudden, a lot of companies started issuing transparency reports about government demands for user data because there was a trust deficit there because of the lack of transparency about government surveillance through particularly through U.S. companies. But advocates kept pushing for companies to do more than just data related to privacy and surveillance, to be more transparent about content takedowns, not just in response to government demands, but response to other actors who want content taken down, whether it's copyright holders or people suing for libel or et cetera, and also for transparency about content moderation. That was pretty slow going. Ranking Digital Rights issued its first corporate accountability index in 2015, and there was one indicator that looked at whether companies published any data about the volume and nature of content restricted to enforce terms of service. It was a flat line, 0. Nobody reported anything. Then Cambridge Analytica happened in 2016. Lo and behold, people realized there was a real trust deficit about how content was being manipulated online, not just directly by governments, but by various actors. And suddenly we started seeing more transparency reporting around content. We had the Santa Clara principles released, which also sort of helped move the ball there. We also started to see more and more concern about algorithmic amplification around targeted advertising, and how both of those factors are manipulating people's information environments so that they don't understand that the picture they're receiving, who's manipulating it to what end, under what authority. So pushing for more transparency there. When I was with Ranking Digital Rights, our last index was looking for transparency both around targeted advertising and advertising practices generally, as well as algorithmic greater transparency around how algorithms were recommending content and amplifying content. Twitter sort of came out on top in the last index in terms of being more open with the public about the various factors that influence what people see. But there is a very long way to go. And the point being, not that transparency is the end all or be all, but again, if you don't know who has access to your data for what purposes and how it's going to be used, and if you don't have clarity about how your information environment is being manipulated, what you know, why you're learning about it, whose agenda is it advancing, how can you control any of that, what choices do you have? If you don't have choice, if you can't hold abuse accountable because you don't know enough about what's going on, then we're not going to have freedom or self-determination as human beings. So that, in a nutshell, is from 2005 to the present, and I hand it off to the rest to talk more about the future.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's really helpful to get that whole perspective of the evolution of this. And it's something where I think that history will be familiar to some of the folks in attendance, but I think it's really not that familiar to the much wider group of people who are now talking about transparency and really kind of looking at things like transparency reports that have come and just sort of expecting them as an industry standard because they have become that. And it's really interesting to hear about how we didn't even know to ask for transparency reports until the idea and the model was sort of invented. And I think it's a great reminder, too, that we should really be trying to be as inventive and as innovative as we think about what else do we want in transparency or what other kinds of information do we want. But now I'd love to pull other speakers into the conversation. I'll go next to Clara. So you've worked on national security and counterterrorism in a variety of capacities, including for the Department of Defense and at Facebook. And I'd like to know, like, when you think about tech company transparency, what's the kind of information that you're looking for? And what are the kinds of problems that you're looking to solve?
Thanks, Emma. Well, I think Rebecca's rundown was absolutely critical because I think we need to remind ourselves of the model. Why are we asking these questions in the first place? Why are we even all here in the first place? And that's because of companies operating in China and their, draconian practices and their attempts to impinge upon, America, our culture of free speech, how we build these platforms, with that culture sort of ingrained initially. And then we go in China and we're all of a sudden confronted with a completely different culture surrounding some of our norms, et cetera. So adhering to that model, remembering that model, being reminded of that model, I think is the best thing that could come out of this panel today. But I do sort of want to play off of Rebecca's comments as well. So yes, clearly, I think American private companies should establish their principles. The one principle to coalesce around transparency that Rebecca highlighted, perfect. But I think that American companies should also now start to get extremely concrete. They should establish a rule set to establish this transparency when dealing with authoritarian countries. Why? We all know about the problems with free expression in authoritarian countries, and even in what we would consider global swing states, those states with elements of authoritarian governments and some elements of democratic governance as well. I would say Brazil is one of these, India, these sorts of places. But now you look at encroachment on freedom of expression occurring outside of authoritarian countries because of these authoritarian values being impressed upon our private companies. And I would say YouTube is an example of this when they took down videos of testimonies from Xinjiang from a Kazakh human rights channel, Zoom acquiescing to Beijing last year when it came to the account of a Chinese human rights activist, Bing censoring images, and this is Microsoft owned, of Tank Man this month, or sorry, not this month, back in the summer, TikTok censoring Hong Kong protests, Tiananmen Square, etc. I don't know if anyone watched the testimony of the TikTok representative sitting there in front of Congress, but he basically said, TikTok does not censor now. I think that tells you all you need to know about some of the reporting that was done about TikTok's practices, especially before February 2019, where we're unsure if they shared US user data with China or stored it there, which they profess to only store in US and Singapore now. There's a lot of good open source detective work being done to sort of pick apart those proclamations by TikTok as well. So stay tuned for more on that from others much smarter than me. And then you have things like Disney Plus, right? Likely censoring that Simpsons episode in Hong Kong. So we not only just see these platforms operating, if they're operating outside of US borders, they are sort of acquiescing to China's rules of the road. But now we're seeing it on American platforms, American privately owned companies. So I think we need to develop a framework to form a foundation for this rule set for private companies to implement. I think this can be helped with the interagency, the State Department, Commerce Department. They have a lot of work on end use of technologies and the entity listings as well. So how these technologies are used sort of for ill in the world, they can sort of have a voice given some of the know-how that they've developed over the past multiple years, in fact, to deal with some of this issue. So I think as a starting point, this framework should account for, actually, I'll move broadly that, because that, okay, I think everyone understands that. So I think there's also something too when it comes to other platforms like TikTok, right? So these are TikTok owned by ByteDance, a Chinese-based company. Their parent company is headquartered in China. All right, so if these specific companies want entry into a US marketplace, they're already here, but now I think we need to retrofit some protections. We should have a rule set focused on transparency for companies like that, foreign owned, seeking entry into the US market, in particular when it comes to these digital platforms that operate in the information environment, like account for an app's parent company, the legal atmosphere of its home jurisdiction. We know that the relationship between the private sector and the CCP in China, very, very different than the relationship between the government and the private sector here. So I think that needs to fit into the calculus of these frameworks and these rule sets. Such a rule set should also encompass the type of data these applications collect, like is it collecting biometric data, behavioral data? What is the size of the American user base of this platform that wants to operate in America? What does the scale look like? And what is the overall hard security of this platform? So making sure that we sort of account for a changing information environment that really does depend on the legal atmosphere of where these companies exist and come from. I think it is important, and you have to be able to articulate that. You can't say, oh, just because it comes from China, we don't want it, but you have to sort of break it down underneath a specific set of criteria, and I think that makes sense. So in terms of transparency, right? What are we looking for? Details on law enforcement requests from officials. Yeah, that clearly makes sense. Rebecca alluded to this as well, especially for requests for data and information from authoritarian countries. Huge. When Airbnb gives up user data to an authoritarian regime or decides to expand its giving up of this user data to an authoritarian regime, the public should know about that. I think also from a more domestic free expression standpoint, I would like to see, more details in these voluntary transparency reports that these companies are publicizing quarterly, not all of them, in fact. So they do the law enforcement response requests, numbers and data. They talk about their enforcement of community standards, et cetera. But I'd like to see more on their content moderation practices, their behaviors. What does this actually look like? Did they make mistakes? Why? What have they done to sort of rectify these mistakes, especially when it comes to political speech? I think reporting on their methodology and their decisions, reporting that to enforcement mechanisms within the United States government itself with the public availability component is one idea. I think it's huge. Again, the public should know, as Rebecca said, the public should be able to hold these tech companies accountable for their behavior, and they should be able to control not only their experience, but their data on these platforms too. So that accountability factor that Rebecca highlighted, the user control issue, I think that's huge as well. And then finally, I think, again, Rebecca scooped me here, but a lot of people talk about this clearly, the algorithmic transparency. And this can be different than the proprietary design of the algorithms, the lifeblood of these companies and how they make money, essentially. But instead, let's report maybe on how these algorithms operate and how they impact and affect users. So more transparency on that in particular, I think would go a long way in helping to hold these tech companies accountable and, keeping them frankly accountable to the people that they serve and the markets they serve.
Well, thank you so much, Clara. That was a fantastic overview of kind of a lot of the different conversations going on in transparency, and especially like looking at the role of regulation in transparency and what that might actually be able to accomplish. And I hope we get to dig more into that during this conversation, but we will definitely be talking about that in a few other panels this week. So if folks are interested in really diving into that conversation, I hope you'll join us for those. Now I want to, in our kind of continued survey of kind of the big general categories where we might be talking about, or that we might mean when we're talking about transparency, I want to turn next to Dunstan. So Dunstan, your work at BSR covers a whole range of independent assessments, including human rights impact assessments and other ways of facilitating regular review of and reporting about company practices. So can you give us a sense of the current state of play in reporting standards in the tech industry and how this fits into the broader transparency conversation?
Yeah, so thank you, Emma, and thank you, first of all, for the invitation to speak on a topic that's very close to my heart. And it's close to my heart because long before I found myself in the technology and human rights field, I participated in the world of sustainability disclosure standards, much of which predates today's interest in transparency in the tech industry. There's an organization called the Global Reporting Initiative. So not the Global Network Initiative, the Global Reporting Initiative, slightly different acronym, which has become one of the main standard-setting organizations for how companies in all industries report on their social and environmental impacts. And that turns 25 next year, which is 1 year older than Google, not as old as Neil's Factories and Forests, but it's been around for a quarter of a century. Now, much more recently, I've been involved with working with technology companies to undertake the human rights assessments that you mentioned, Emma. And here, this question of whether to publish the assessment and how much of the assessment to publish has become a very hot topic. Now, I've probably been involved in something like 75 or 100 different human rights assessments of different shapes and sizes of different topics at technology companies. And I would say today, only about a dozen or so of those are in public, or in the public in some shape or form. So you've got these two different worlds, sustainability reporting standards and human rights assessments being undertaken at technology companies. But those two worlds are about to come to a head. And I would like to apologize for the excessive jargon in what follows, but I'm gonna run with it because there are some things happening that I think set important context. So first of all, they UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which many of you will be very familiar with. For others, it may be new, but it's the core document for the world of business and human rights, has recently been integrated into the Global Reporting Initiative standards that I mentioned. We're also expecting something very similar with mandatory European Union social and environmental disclosure standards for all companies doing business in Europe. So although it will be a European standard, all American companies doing business in Europe will have to comply with these emerging European Union standards, which will incorporate, I'm assuming, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So that means things like disclosing a company's human rights impacts, disclosing how those human rights impacts have been identified, disclosing how they're being addressed. So there's a lot of relevant things going on in the European Union and with international standard setting bodies that we should think about. There's another organization, I told you there'd be a lot of jargon, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which has a lot of influence in the accounting world. And for those that are interested in the accounting world, there's a lot going on today in how to create new non-financial reporting standards for companies. They have a work stream on content governance and content governance disclosures by social media companies. So we have these sort of big developments around standard setting that are not unique to the technology industry. They apply to all companies of all sizes, in all industries, in all locations. How the technology industry responds to those developments, I think, is an open question. And in fact, the uptake of the standards that I've described on a voluntary basis is generally lower in the technology industry than it is in other industries. And we can perhaps have a discussion on that. So there is a lot of, the good news is there's a lot of good work underway to increase transparency from technology companies. But for this discussion, I think there are three questions that it would be useful to think about. First of all, what disclosure from companies is useful and will enable all of us to effectively evaluate what approaches companies are taking to respecting human rights? As I mentioned, there's a lot of focus on the human rights assessment and making the human rights assessment public. For me, that's just one part of a much bigger picture and a much bigger discussion we need to have. And the second is, how do we apply reporting best practices and disclosures so that reporting is reliable, accurate, and comparable across companies and over time? You know, Rebecca described how we didn't know to ask for a transparency report until one was created. Well, how do we make sure that they're created in a way that adheres to best practices in disclosure that predates the tech and human rights sort of dialogue? And then third, how do we make sure that the emerging standards and regulations that are coming our way result in meaningful disclosures and are not sort of formulaic and checklist-based approaches? So when I work with companies and talk about these emerging standards, these emerging regulations, they'll say, well, this is a shame because this becomes a checklist approach. This becomes something we just do because we have to. And I always think there's got to be power in and, right? How do we have something that is required in such a way that you get meaningful disclosure across all companies, that's comparable, that's standardized, that's something we can all sort of expect from every company, but is also something that is entrepreneurial, that is that we evolve as time goes by, as we make, as we create reports that are decision useful for those of us that are reading them. So that's an attempt to shape the sort of broader standard setting world. I haven't gotten into topics like access to data from for researchers, which I know we're going to get into in a moment. There's a lot in that transparency box. My key message is I think the technology industry should be thinking about the future of transparency, partly in the context of these broader standard setting processes that are underway and thinking about how they should be applied in this industry.
Thank you so much, Dunstan. I think I love those framing questions that you share, in part because I think it also immediately starts drawing our attention to those tensions, right? The desire on the one hand for transparency and information coming out of companies to be comparable across different companies and over time, maybe being in tension with the need for things to be flexible and iterative and all of those great jargon words from the tech industry of, wanting to continually be reinventing products and services and approaches to things, partly because that can really help improve things or, create innovation, create new ways of tackling problems, but also potentially making it that every report or every bit of information coming out of a company kind of exists in an untethered netherworld of, well, here's a data point and you don't have anything else to compare it to. So yeah, I'd love to dig into that. And I also want to remind our attendees that you are very welcome to ask questions. We will have a little bit of time at the end for your questions. And so just use the Q&A or send in an email or tweet at our CDT staff and they'll be able to feed your questions in. But now I want to bring in our last speaker, Rebecca Tromble. So Rebecca, the issue of researcher access to data has taken on such greater prominence, even just it feels like in the past few months since the Frances Haugen leaks, looking at this whole question of what is the kind of information that tech companies have that they do research on internally and that outside researchers are kind of desperate to get their hands on. And then just today, the Internal Markets Committee of the European Parliament voted out a draft of the Digital Services Act, Europe's big kind of revision to their intermediary liability law that actually includes a researcher access to data type provision. So legislation on this topic is coming soon, if not in the US, then definitely in Europe. Can you give us an overview of some of the kind of key challenges and roadblocks that have been coming up in this question of facilitating researcher access to data?
Yeah, absolutely. And as all of my predecessors on the panel have said, first and foremost, thanks so much for having me today. It's a real pleasure to be in conversation with all of you here. There are all sorts of exciting developments happening both in Europe and the US. And I should let those in the audience know who weren't aware already that I've actually been doing the vast majority of my work on this question of researcher access to data, in Europe first, because what we've seen is that most of the initial movement has actually been coming from the European Union in this area, as well as questions about platform transparency much more broadly. Europe has been the first mover in this space. And so I'm chairing a working group on access to platform data for the purposes of social scientific research that is developing a code of conduct under GDPR. And this points to what I think is probably the first and most fundamental tension in the relationship between transparency and data access on the one hand, and on the other hand, the recognition of users' rights to privacy and users' rights in general. I think the key takeaway when we're considering this tension is that, yes, indeed, there is a tension, but it's not one that's impossible to overcome. So I want to walk through just a few key considerations to keep in mind as we've been discussing in our working group and as I'm having these conversations with policymakers in the US as well, that we need to keep in mind as we're trying to work out the logistics for access to data for researchers. Let me say at the outset, though, that I think that it's quite ironic that the platforms use this argument about user privacy quite effectively as a shield, that they conveniently take the most privacy protecting position only when transparency is the effort in question. And so when we hear these arguments coming from the platforms about user privacy in these debates, we need to keep that in mind, while at the same time recognizing from our position as those who seek transparency that we really do have to take user privacy seriously. It has to be at the forefront of our considerations. So I think to achieve that, the core goal, the starting point needs to be a commitment to data minimization. As we're laying out the sort of research questions that we want to investigate, we have to make a commitment to using as little data as possible as is needed to appropriately answer those questions. We can't go into the research with this sort of, big-eyed vision that we want to get our hands on everything. That simply isn't respectful of users' privacy and users' rights. Ultimately, we want to anonymize data when possible, but I will say that when we're dealing with big data, which in most cases we are, anonymization simply isn't feasible, because in practice, even when we take directly personally identifiable markers, features off of the data, when we're using big data, frequently that data can still be re-identified, can still be traced back to individual users. And so for most practical purposes, anonymization isn't feasible. And I think we need to move beyond anonymization as the end-all be-all goal when we're talking about user privacy. To add to that, we have to keep in mind that some of the most important and pressing questions of the day require the analysis not just of PII, but of sensitive information and sensitive data. We can't answer absolutely fundamental questions that are affecting our democratic societies today without looking at some of this sensitive data. And so what that means is that we need to also, on top of making a commitment to data minimization, we also need to make a commitment to achieving informed consent whenever possible. And finally, to implementing a series of procedures that ensure that the researchers themselves who are getting access to the data are doing so under very high standards of ethical and of ethical practice and of security considerations. So in some instances, this means using things like data clean rooms, where researchers actually cannot take the data points away themselves, cannot download them. They have to analyze the data in a sanitized environment and effectively themselves be monitored and face liability if they misuse the data and violate users' rights in any way. So that's kind of the starting tension that gets at the heart of this. Two very quick ones. I'll run through much more quickly, but I want to add to the list. The second one is this big question about how we handle the governance of this, how we identify what are the appropriate research questions that should be interrogated, what are the appropriate data sets, how are those data sets delivered, and how is enforcement, right, of any potential violations on either side handled. We're looking right now with should the Coons-Portman bill that was just introduced in the Senate move forward, there's sort of a hybrid relationship proposed in that between the NSF and the FTC. I think this is a really good starting place for conversation, but there are even bigger questions that we need to dig into in there, including things like how do we improve the review of ethics research plans from the researchers themselves. For academic institutions, we have IRBs in place, but if we want researchers outside of academia to have access to this data, IRBs can't be the fallback. Plus, we know that IRBs are not actually ideal. And so there's a lot of work to do there in order to make that much more robust. Finally, I want to highlight that at the end of all of this, if we're thinking about transparency being the final goal, we actually have to be able to trust the data that we're receiving access to from the platforms. And, to be quite frank, there isn't a whole lot of trust between the platforms and most other outside actors. And so simply believing, taking at face value when they turn over, when they supply data to researchers, I think is going to be a real problem. So at the end of this process, in order to complete the circle and to make transparency work, I think we ultimately need what I refer to as data pipeline audits. And in very simple terms, that combines three types of approaches to understanding what data has been provided. It includes sort of traditional interviewing auditing mechanisms. It includes code review, and crucially, it includes the ability for researchers/auditors to be able to inject synthetic data into the data pipelines and review the outputs of those. So to sum it all up, we're making a ton of progress. And I'm particularly excited to see where things are going in Europe at the moment right now. But we still have a lot of difficult questions, particularly around that area of governance that we need to address in order to do this right, to achieve both transparency and protect users' rights in the process.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was a really excellent kind of introduction to the topic. And from all of our panelists, thank you so much for giving us these wonderful overviews that really help kind of underscore this point that there are a lot of different questions to be asking when we talk about wanting more transparency from technology companies. We are running a little bit short on time, so I'm actually going to hop us right to final statements, final comments from our panelists so that we can make sure we get to the next panel on time. But I'd like to hear from everybody, and we can just go right through the same order we took for opening comments. Since it's the end of the year, everyone's looking forward to 2022 after hopefully getting to take some nice vacation at the end of the year. What are you looking for next in transparency? What are the things you have your eye on happening in 2022? And Rebecca, to you first.
Thanks. Well, just speaking from my current role as Vice President for Global Advocacy at the Wikimedia Foundation, and as more, particularly in Europe, but also elsewhere, there's increasingly both regulations that are expecting transparency as well as kind of stakeholder expectations for transparency. One priority of mine and of my colleagues is to make sure we don't forget that the internet and internet platforms is not only comprised of commercial entities with centralized content moderation and kind of data collection and use models, that we need to make sure that we think about the vision for the internet we want to have, in which citizens can create, build, operate, and govern their own open knowledge projects, online communities, and that their right to do so is protected, and that we're not requiring forms of transparency that only work for, Facebook or Twitter or Google, but kind of that we need to sort of ground our expectations around transparency in the ultimate purpose, which is really human rights, which is really freedom and self-determination of people and communities around the world. So, for example, when we're thinking about transparency around content moderation, that looks one way when you're thinking about a centralized platform that employs content moderators. When you have a community model of setting rules for different language iterations, different projects, different knowledge contexts, community enforcing. When you are already, you can go on the website and see every single edit that was ever made and every single debate about whether a piece of content goes up or down. Your expectations around transparency or kind of requirements might be different, and also balancing the need for transparency around who is speaking online with privacy and security of members of vulnerable communities who face reprisals for participating in online discourse, which brings to the data minimization principle for platforms generally, not just for researchers, which is transparency is fine and good, but let's be careful about kind of what we're collecting in the first place and why, and also just then kind of what we're sharing and why with whom, and the best framework to ensure that transparency remains grounded in human rights is not just for companies to have clear commitments to human rights principles in how they kind of think about their accountability to the public, but also researchers and nonprofit communities that we're designing our activities and our work in accordance with human rights principles. So that's maybe longer than it should have been, but that's my final word.
A lot to look forward to in 2022. Clara, same question.
Yep. So Rebecca scooped me yet again, but I was going to focus on the fact that I hope for 2022, we don't have to convene groups like us and talk about the need for transparency, because I hope that more companies and as the Rebecca number 2 said, researchers will, the data minimization factor, but mostly the privacy by design factor. So I hope that these companies will explore in earnest, and I know some are right now, and government related laboratories are as well, but I want those options for privacy preserving and enhancing technologies to be pervasive across the industry. Hopefully it'll be industry standard to conduct differential privacy, federated models of machine learning. There's different internet protocols that can be used as well to protect not just user data, but how we access data, what that looks like, privacy preserving computation on sensitive private data. Fantastic. So in 2022, I really hope that that is the name of the game: privacy by design, privacy preserving technologies, and that we don't necessarily have to keep screaming from the rooftops about transparency, because we will build it in at the outset.
I love to hear it. Yes. Dunstan, how about you?
Thanks, Emma. So 2 points, and they're both, I think, an appeal to see where tech fits in the broader, wider context. So the first point is that transparency about the impact of technology is not just about transparency by technology companies. What transparency do we expect from companies in other industries that are deploying technology? What about transparency from financial services companies, retailers, healthcare companies? They're all deploying technology, making really important decisions when they do so. But we've got so much focus on transparency from tech companies, I think we risk taking our eye off the ball with non-tech companies. The second point is there is this broader trend around environmental, social governance disclosures, and a lot of momentum and investment in what they should be. I fear a world where those of us in the human rights field are not having enough influence on environmental, social governance disclosures because we're not participating enough in that world. So how do we make sure that the emerging frameworks for ESG disclosure are consistent with a human rights-based approach?
Opening even more frontiers for all of us to be working on and focused on in the coming year. And finally, Rebecca Tromble, over to you.
Thanks so much. So I am going to be looking in the next year at key regulatory steps that are taken first in Europe and then second in the US. I think what we've seen out of the European Parliament today is that there's definitely going to be a commitment, and we can expect by early 2023 for the DSA to be in act and to enforce and to be actually having some impacts in the world of transparency. The US is clearly going to be further behind, and I desperately want privacy by design, exactly as Clara is describing. I haven't seen a lot of movement to that leaves me terribly encouraged that we're moving in the right direction there. But ultimately, what I hope that the transparency measures that we can get in place will achieve beyond 2022 and 2023 is that I, as a researcher looking at online harms to users, that I'm out of a job, that I no longer have this area of inquiry because we have privacy by design, because we have the platforms then, on the basis of research and on the basis of transparency measures, doing things to protect their users from the very beginning of the design process. And I have very little to research and to investigate from there on out. So that's my dream, that I work myself out of a job.
Showing a key distinction maybe between academic researchers and lawyers. That would be a wonderful, wonderful future. Thank you all so much for this really excellent overview. We really appreciate it. And for all of our attendees, now we're going to take a very short 1 or 2 minute break just as we transfer over our speakers and welcome our next panelists to the virtual stage. So please sit tight and join us for the second panel, User-Centric Approaches to Transparency, which will be starting soon.
Thank you.
guys hear me?
Hello, everybody.
Hi, welcome
Hey, Daphne.
everyone. My name is Caitlin Bogus. I'm the Deputy Director of CDT's Free Expression Project. I'm excited to welcome you to our second panel for the Future of Speech Online Day 1, which is empowering users through transparency. So today's panel is about how transparency can help users empower them in taking control of their experiences online, especially users from communities who face increased barriers and challenges when they're participating online, things like abuse, harassment, and disinformation. We have 4 wonderful speakers today that I'm going to introduce shortly, but I just wanted to tell the audience that we are taking questions for the end of the panel. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom or send us questions via email at questions@cdt.org. So on to our panelists. Our first panelist is Matt Bailey. He is PEN America's Digital Freedom Program Director, focusing on issues ranging from surveillance and disinformation to digital inclusion that affect journalists and writers around the world. Matt previously served as a senior advisor for the National Democratic Institute, as a civil servant in the Office of the United States Chief Information Officer, and as the first director of technology innovation for the city of Washington, D.C. Next, we have Nora Benavides, who is a civil and human rights attorney, and she works at the intersection of law, tech, and democracy. She serves as the senior counsel and director for digital justice and civil rights at Free Press, where she leads the organization's efforts to protect against digital threats to democracy and to push for media and platform accountability. And Nora previously served as the director of PEN America's U.S. Free Expression programs. Next, we have Daphne Keller. Daphne's work focuses on platform regulation and internet users' rights. She has testified before legislatures, courts, and regulatory bodies around the world, and she's published both academically and in the popular press on topics including platform content moderation practices, constitutional and human rights law, copyright, data protection, and many other issues. Her recent work focuses on legal protections for users' free expression rights when state and private power intersect, particularly through platforms' enforcement of terms of service or use of algorithmic ranking and recommendation. And last but not least, we have Dr. Nicole Turner Lee, who is a senior fellow in governance studies and the director of the Center for Technology Innovation. And she serves as co-editor-in-chief of Tech Tank. Dr. Turner Lee researches public policy designed to enable equitable access to technology across the US and to harness its power to create change in communities across the world. She has a forthcoming book on the US digital divide that's titled Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. So I'm really excited to talk with each of our speakers today about empowering users through transparency. And I'd like to start first with Daphne, who's written extensively about tech company transparency and also advised companies and lawmakers on tech transparency. So Daphne, can you set the stage for us a little bit by describing how users specifically benefit from transparency and the kind of transparency that's most helpful to users as opposed to maybe experts or regulators?
Sure. And I think it's really useful that you're kind of granularly focusing on users that way, because as we heard in the last panel, we're in this moment of political opportunity where some rules for transparency are going to get finalized. And the people who are writing them don't necessarily know what they want or for what purpose. And so being granular and saying, here's what users want, here's what researchers want, et cetera, I think is really important right now. So for users, the simplest thing is sort of a consumer protection interest. You know, when you sign up for a platform, what are the rules? If you have had an action taken against your content, you know, do you get notified and do you get an explanation of why that happened? Those are all, of course, most valuable in a world with competition and other platforms to switch to if you don't like the rules in the platform you're currently signing up for. But in any case, you know, even if you're trapped within one platform, you want to know what the rules are. Secondly, users specifically need to get the information that protects them from abuse by people who influence platforms. So if your government told Facebook to take down your post, as Palestinian activists said happened to them in Israel, you should know. You should get a notification that specifies that's what happened. Or if your commercial rival was the source of a notice, which happens all the time, or your political rival. Knowing who requested it and on what basis is the predicate for being able to defend your rights if you're being abused. Then there are user interests that need interpreters. So if as users we care about patterns of dissemination of misinformation, maybe targeting vulnerable communities, you need a big data set to spot that. No one user is going to see it from the notices that they're going to use to see. And so, that's a disclosure to researchers or to government, but it's in the user's interest. Similarly, when content moderation is done by algorithm and it's not an action against a specific piece of content, that affects everyone whose content was, demoted or promoted, or it affects what we're seeing. But you can't spot that without a big data set or without disclosures that are about some pretty wonky algorithmic details that, again, no one user is uniquely affected by. I do want to flag, though, there's a tension about transparency about how speech rules are enforced, in that on the one hand, I think we want a diversity of platforms with a diversity of speech rules. And to be valuable, those differences in speech rules are going to be pretty granular and nuanced. What does Facebook think is too sexual versus what does Reddit or Medium think is too sexual or too violent? Do you prohibit offensive slurs or racial epithets completely, or do you permit them in an artistic context like rap lyrics, or a historical context like educational images of Nazi propaganda? Things get really granular in ways that are important, but which also make it very hard to do apples to apples comparison if you're asking, how many posts did this platform remove for violence or for nudity or for sexuality compared to another one. And so as we ask for the kind of transparency that users and the general public and lawmakers want, I think we need to be really careful to keep in mind that trade-off. And my preference is to avoid that trade-off, to say we really do value having a diversity of speech rules, even if it means we can't get perfect insight into exactly how the enforcement compares across platforms.
Thanks, Daphne. Thanks for that overview and a little bit about the trade-offs too. I want to turn to our other panelists to hear from them a bit about how kind of different communities are affected when they engage online. So Nora, starting with you, your work at Free Press has really highlighted the way that communities of color and also non-English speaking communities have been targeted by disinformation online. Can you describe what you found about targeted online disinformation and some examples of how disinformation impacts those communities specifically?
Sure. Well, first, it's great to be here with all of you. This is a great discussion, and I think centering users, as Daphne said at the top, is really important as a distinction from some of the other ways we might think about transparency and the need for it. I guess I'll sort of, at the risk of going too deep in the weeds, I think it's often useful for people to remember some of the most concrete examples where maligned operatives and content online has very real world effects. Not to do a history lesson of any sort in defining the problem again ad nauseum, but partly because it can feel like an abstract concept when we're not really aware of who's being harmed and how. And so some of the sort of smattering of examples are both newer and older. But one is, I think it's important to know a little bit about what's happening regarding COVID. And what Free Press has been looking at for some time is the ways that Spanish language and non-English content have very specific effects for communities of color and for immigrant and non-English speaking communities. For example, research from the Markup has shown that communities of color, Black, Latinx, Native American, Middle Eastern communities have been shown and given by Facebook less credible information from the World Health Organization about the COVID vaccine. An interesting finding, which I think really speaks to some of the upstream problems we'll get into today. Another example that many of us are aware of is the way Facebook served discriminatory ads to users in violation of the Fair Housing Act, which prompted HUD a couple of years ago to bring a lawsuit. At that time, documents showed that Facebook was allowing advertisers to target users based on location and other identity markers, which really could be proxies for protected categories and resulted in Black users seeing less or no ads for certain housing. Facebook has continued to run these types of ads, and even a year plus after the lawsuit settled, those practices continued. With respect to election issues, we've seen that there were very specific ways that Latinx and Native American populations in various states on the West Coast around Arizona, New Mexico, and others were targeted with certain types of content that specifically played on distrust and fears around immigration and raids and sort of immigration status, to imply that there were going to be people at election and polling locations with guns, that there would be Homeland Security officials waiting to pick people up, irrespective of people's status, but really kind of playing on the ways that people might actually then not come out and vote. And so across these, right, like I don't want to take too much time in describing more examples, but from COVID to some of the ways that the systemic and third-party issues that play on identity and the way identity has been crafted by our platforms, to then the electoral democracy related content, all of this, I think, speaks to a few things. One is we still don't actually have enough information about the harms and the impact, Caitlin, to your question. And it's part of why I think transparency is the first step in meaningful reform. It can't be everything, but part of what we need are two different types of transparency. And I want to be really clear in the ways that Free Press has been defining this. One is data transparency around what are the kinds of ways that data brokers are gathering incredibly private and sensitive information about people and users. And then what are the other ways we might call for transparency about the impact of business models by the platforms? And so in thinking about how specific communities are harmed, I think we often sort of gloss over what the solutions can be in just saying groups are harmed and there's that. And I just want to kind of like elevate here that when communities are affected, there is no monolith for them. It's not that Black voters are harmed in the same ways. It's that these are hyper local specific examples that play on our identities and our online behaviors. And what I think our first step needs to be in reform is really understanding and wrapping our arms around what the problem looks like, so that then whatever reforms come after transparency, we have a better understanding of how we employ regulatory policy and other types of platform reforms and changes.
Thanks, Nora. Those are some really disturbing examples. And I know, unfortunately, you could probably fill the whole panel with more examples. So thanks for laying that out for us. Matt, I want to turn to you because earlier this year, PEN America published a really fantastic report called No Excuse for Abuse. And in that report, you wrote about how writers and journalists, and especially those who identify as women, as people of color, as members of the LGBTQ community, or as members of religious or ethnic communities, all of those groups face increased online abuse and harassment. And so can you tell us what your research has shown about the harassment that these writers face and how it impacts them and the barriers that they face in trying to prevent or respond to it?
Yeah, thank you. And I want to underscore the point that Nora made, which is that our data is wildly incomplete. And because these issues are both sort of endemic, ADL did a good study that showed that roughly half of Americans report having experienced online abuse. So that's what I mean by endemic, but they're also intersectional, which means if you are an American, but you're a journalist and you're a woman of color or a gender nonconforming individual, the rates at which you're experiencing these issues soar dramatically. Because CPJ found that Black women journalists experience roughly 34% increased rate of online harassment and abuse relative to white women. And then you can compare that relative to the general public. So it's both dramatically more frequent on a kind of intersectional grounds, but it's also something where the texture of the abuse, the ways that it's being targeted, and I think this again calls back to Nora's points, are specific, and they also are rapidly evolving in the context of the platforms and the context of our political environment. So, in our direct interactions with newsrooms, with activists, with community leaders, we're finding is all of this is true. And the more that you interact with community leaders or with journalists or anybody on the front lines, the more you find that the things that they're experiencing are not well reflected either in the aggregate data or in the general approaches that we're taking to try to create transparency or try to create accountability on the platforms. So far, I think most of our discussion has been largely US focused, but just to zoom out, you think about issues of content moderation, cultural competency in places like, just to pick a couple that I've done some work personally, North Macedonia or in Uganda. These are places where not only is the data even more sort of geometrically less complete, but the content moderation that's taking place is less targeted as well, whether that's AI or human-led moderation. So there's a call for just a need for foundational data, like what the heck is going on, for the approaches to retrieving that data to be respective of that intersectional nature of the abuse. And also, I think to worry about not just sort of aggregate statistical data, but also rich qualitative and testimonial data from individuals who are experiencing it.
Thanks, Matt. I agree with you. That point about intersectionality is so important, and I really appreciate you highlighting that for our conversation. Nicole, I'd like to take it to you, and if you could tell us a little bit about your research focusing on algorithmic bias, and maybe specifically how biases in the algorithmic targeting or recommendation of content, including ads and things like that, impacts communities of color online.
Yeah, no, thank you, Caitlin, and it's glad to be here with distinguished colleagues and friends. So, at the end of the day, I think what you're hearing from all of the panelists is that discrimination and bias is normative, and it has a particular effect on communities of color and other vulnerable populations who are already experiencing the type of systemic inequalities that technology has just worsened. And so a couple things I'd just like to do to respond to your question to sort of level set is that we have to understand that this is normative now, and we need to get into the stage of coming up with some pragmatic solutions that allow us to sort of stop the type of impacts that we're actually creating, both intended and unintended, on certain populations. So I'm happy that CDT is having this conversation. When I say that bias is normative, I actually mean that, because what we are finding is that computers do not discriminate, people do. People bring their values, norms, and assumptions to the table. And in my research, that's what I'm basically arguing, that these computer models just don't show up and all of a sudden engage in explicit and implicit biases. They actually come from a place where the designers have particular assumptions and profiles of particular subjects that they're looking at. With that being the case, that's what we start to see, Caitlin, what you're trying to ask is like these civil and human rights harms, because technology not only can directly identify someone by the information, the data trails that people actually leave behind, but they also have the ability to use inferential data, online proxies that mask and hide and obscure, quote unquote, the characteristics of certain populations. So Tanya Sweeney's work tells us that. She tells us that people with Black sounding and Hispanic sounding names tend to get offered credit card offerings that are higher interest and predatory. We're finding that out in some recent work that we actually put out at Brookings in terms of Facebook's racial discrimination when it comes to ads, when you sort of move away from what you think are the proxies that define affinity groups of color, but really they offer a greater precision of discrimination because you can actually exclude those groups. With that being the case, what do you do about that? I mean, obviously, as an advocate and a scholar, we have to figure out ways to sort of peel that back. And part of the challenge of peeling that back is that we haven't had the discussion, and this is where my research comes into play. You look at bias as being defined as when similarly situated people, places, and objects receive either differential treatment. So I like Black dresses, and I'm okay with ads that send me Black dresses, but I don't want disparate impact, where that Black dress serves as a marker in my data trails to identify me as a Black woman who then receives predatory or ads or finds myself being surveilled or profiled as a Black woman. I think that's where the challenge is when we look at my work on bias, because first and foremost, we don't have enough people like me at the table who are actually working on these issues and who have the lived experiences of the groups in which these technologies are prioritized and contextualized. That's the first thing. The second thing, we don't have a clear sense of bias because we live in an opaque technological sphere where many of these algorithms live underground and they're not identifiable. It's hard to prove disparate impact because two people are never the same when they actually are engaging. And our data trails due to the absence of privacy legislation, are just open season and people can collect whatever they want about us. The third thing I would just say, sort of answer your question, the challenge in defining bias is we don't have a civil rights regime that's agile enough for us to actually go ahead and do due process around civil rights and human rights violations. What experiences I have not yet triggered the ability to say that there is some civil rights violation. Nora talked about the Facebook case with regards to HUD. There was some remediation, but we need to go back and look at what public accommodation law really looks like in the online space. It's not the Woolworth counter that we're dealing with here, folks. We're dealing with something that is much more opaque, below the surface, that continues to have persistent systemic inequality effects on populations that we're talking about today. So I would just say, as a sociologist, the research that I'm trying to do is socio-technical. It moves us away from just the technical cadence of looking at these technologies in the space of a lab. And it's actually, like many of us on this call, contextualizing it and providing the sociological implications for how we should see how these technologies actually behave in the real world and what their unintended consequences are. I'll talk later about some additional pragmatic solutions. But I have to tell you, I'm so glad we're having this conversation, but we got to get to the point where we actually make this better. Because not only is there reputational risk to the companies that are putting out these ineffective products, but there's also unintended harm that forecloses, and I think we've heard it so far, on the economic, political, and social opportunities that are available to certain segments of society.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, I think many of the panelists here today are working on some of those pragmatic solutions, which can include transparency, at least as a first step, as Nora was saying. So I'd like to turn the conversation that way. And Nora, back to you. I wanted to talk about the Disinformation Defense League policy platform that Free Press recently launched along with other digital and civil rights groups. Can you tell us what the Disinformation Defense League is and what its policy platform is and the role that transparency plays in it when it's talking about combating online disinformation?
Of course. And because it's a mouthful, we can absolutely shorten this to DDL. But for the record, that is the Disinfo Defense League. It is a network of over 200 organizations that are either led by or focused on centering communities of color in the fight against disinformation. So many of these are community-based organizations that have, I think, in their just like daily work as grassroots organizations, very much felt and seen what the local contextual effects are of disinformation. Whether that is, in Arizona, in Texas, in Pennsylvania, like hyper local narratives that these individuals and organizers started picking up on, and they were like, wait, this is very clearly affecting the work we're doing in an X area, like over there, away from tech policy, away from, frankly, anything we're talking about today sometimes. And so these organizations knew that Black, Latinx, Asian American, other communities of color were being affected by and oftentimes deliberately targeted by disinformation. And so the hope in our creating DDL's policy platform, which Free Press led as a process, was to take a step back and say, if there is a very wide world of solutions we should consider in fighting disinformation, one of them must be policy and regulatory reform. It doesn't need to be the only, and I think there's so much strong debunking, media literacy, the kind of defensive work, organizing, working with local trusted networks, which I fully endorse. And we could have a whole other discussion about those. But in trying to advance a policy agenda, what we sought to do was really elevate. And Nicole, I just am so happy you're here. I love that you described the cadence of this and how we change that, because that's really what we're trying to do with the DDL policy platform, is bring in this kind of civil rights lens where we say, we're often focused on the perpetrators. What does it mean to center the victims or the targets, the users online? And that's part of why I was excited about this discussion, is thinking, how can we talk about, data portability, the agency that an individual could have to move their data across platforms and to know how they are being targeted or how their identity is being crafted. And so we spent many months consulting with partners across various organizations, whether Access Now, Cybersecurity for Democracy, Fight for the Future, I'm trying to name everyone. New Georgia Project. I'm not going to get everyone. We had over 36 organizations supporting the platform. And we really are trying to do a few things. I'll keep it very brief because I know we're short on time. But one is we're trying to really elevate that oftentimes communities of color get left out of policy debates on this. And the effect of and consequence, I think, is to Nicole's point, that the normative discrimination here means we have to actually find more innovative ways of talking about the problem and pivoting quickly then so that groups that are left out and traditionally left out of these debates actually feel empowered to come to Congress, to come to an FTC open meeting and talk about how their local grassroots organization is harmed. And so we're trying to give people that kind of confidence, the talking points. And there are 3 big buckets we're pushing in this platform. One are policies that would elevate privacy and civil rights. And I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. Second is the kind of regulatory avenues we need. So how can the White House, how can the FTC, DOJ, and other regulatory agencies be using their authority? The FTC, as one example, has existing authority to take on rulemaking and other investigations into extractive data practices, which I think would be a precursor to getting more transparency into these issues. And then the third piece is a kind of international focus. And I'm glad that this has now been brought up a couple of times by Matt, Nicole. I feel like we need to make sure we're situating this away from a US-centric solutions conversation, knowing that the problem is global. And frankly, I think it's racist. The way that we do not see investment in non-English content on social media platforms, the way that we do not talk about as an ecosystem of experts, the global elections that are happening, we can't only think of this as the lead up to the 2022 midterms in the US. There are dozens of elections happening next year. And so the way that this platform elevates that global context, we are also pushing for the UN to take on a set of solutions and give a roadmap to state governments so that what we're able to provide is not just a kind of piecemeal or sort of ad hoc solution framework. We're really trying to create a space where we say people need to be centered in the conversation. They need to center communities of color. We need to know more about how our data is being used, and we need to see that this is a global scope.
Matt, in the No Excuse for Abuse report, PEN America made some very concrete recommendations to platforms around user design and interfaces that you recommended to decrease harassment and abuse. Could you walk us through some of those recommendations and specifically the ones that are transparency focused?
Yeah, and I guess I would just say, you know, in terms, I'll pull a Nora here in terms of trying to call out the framing of the conversation here. I mean, it's so interesting to put the word empowerment and the word transparency together because traditionally transparency goes with the word accountability. And the question is sort of who is holding whom accountable, who's that feedback loop between the transparency of the data or the information that's being made available, and then whose voice is then being provided as a feedback loop into the systems that are producing the data. So, and I guess this calls back actually to Daphne's original point about consumer protection or consumer empowerment. So a lot of what we were trying to do in No Excuse for Abuse is to center the conversation directly on journalists, particularly journalists of color or journalists with other identities that are exposing them to greater risk of harm online, and to say what would be empowering for those individuals, both in the moment as terrible things are coming at them, and also in raising their voices to provide that feedback into the system. So I'll avoid walking through each of the individual recommendations, except to say that they're almost entirely focused on what we think of as sort of product improvements or user experience, UX improvements. Things that anybody who's experienced these patterns of abuse or coordinated online attacks would recognize as useful. Things like, how about a panic button if all of a sudden the shit hits the fan for you and you have an army of trolls and bots coming at you that allows you to essentially just lock it down, make it stop, preserve the evidence, and figure out what you want to do next. Better tools for delegating account access other than just sharing your password, so that when that same phenomenon is going on, you have the ability to call in your friends, your colleagues, your family members to help contend with what's going on. Better forensic preservation of data and approaches to splitting the difference between getting the information offline versus preserving what you need to take further action on it going forward. Spam filter like approaches to sifting and sorting through the sludge that a lot of people are dealing with that can, the word sludge is actually selling it short, the traumatic and violative content that people are encountering and dealing with day in and day out online. Not so much to censor or holistically remove the content, but to enable individuals to have control over when and how they encounter it and what amounts of it they encounter. And, the other thing that we have in there, and I think this ends up kind of tying back into that overall question of transparency and accountability, is a suite of recommendations that are related to kind of disincentivizing or creating a more thoughtful pause before people engage in what might be abusive or violative conduct online. So, something like 2/3 of the report is really focused on those tools for empowering and arming and raising the voices of targets of abuse. And then the back third is focused on creating moments of pause before people click the tweet button or click the amplify button on online vitriol. And, I think this harkens back, gosh, I'll forget which of, I think we're all agreeing with each other in very elaborate and Baroque ways so far on this panel, but one of the other panelists was mentioning this idea of kind of connecting people's interactions online with what the rules of the road are and creating some transparency there. And so that's really a lot of what we're focused on, is that, if you go today and you try to understand what are the rules on Twitter, there's a separate website, not an app, not in the app, not a separate section in the app, but actually a separate website that you have to go and somehow find. I find myself either digging through my terrible mess of bookmarks or having to literally Google for it every time. The Facebook community standards are the same thing. Like, how do you find it, and how do you relate that directly to your experience in the platform? So we provide a number of recommendations for surfacing what the rules of the road are, as well as providing kind of nudges or designed friction for people as they interact when they get into spaces where they might be bumping up against those rules, and they may want to think twice, either on moral, ethical, and empathetic grounds, not to harm other people online, or because of the consequences that they could face as they engage in trolling and abuse.
Thanks, Matt. I'm kind of heartened to hear you say that you Google the Twitter rules and community standards,
oh my God.
Because I do the same. But it's such an important point for user design. If users can't find the rules easily, they're not at their fingertips, they're going to be less inclined to follow them. Nicole, so speaking of kind of consumer protection, I know that policymakers around the world are focusing on algorithmic transparency. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, what do you think the best approach is for giving users more transparency about the use of algorithms online? Algorithms are complicated, and how can we let regular non-technical people know about the risks that they pose and the biases that they can perpetuate?
So I love that question, because I often think, and some people may find this offensive, that the word transparency is often like overrated and misused. And I'll tell you why. I mean, at the end of the day, policymakers are really concerned about the predicted decisions and the eligibility determinations that come out of these models. The type of continuums of harm, whether it's voter suppression and exploitation, to whether or not facial recognition misidentifies people because of their skin color. All of that is really what policymakers are trying to actually identify and mitigate. And we say transparency, I would suggest that we don't have the research expertise within these circles to be able to do that in a formative way. So I would just start there. So the question, though, is then how do you consumers to actually recognize that these biases are happening? And that's tough, because one, consumers actually trust in the society that we live in today, which does not often, although in the last 5 to 10 years, it's actually increased the type of discrimination and outright violence against communities of color, but we expect that there's some codes of conduct when it comes to civil and human rights, right? And so I think one of the ways that we actually have to start in terms of giving consumers a leg up is to set this floor around civil rights. Tech companies should not be given the permission to break things and apologize later. Permissionless innovation allowed for that, but we have to move away from permissionless forgiveness so that we follow the cadence of civil rights laws for people who already litigated and mitigated those consequences. I'm sticking to that as something that I truly believe in. It's a project that we're working on at Brookings. We're going to be putting out some stuff on this, but you have to really look at how do the civil rights laws apply to the new digital economy. With that being said, I think that there's some new research that I'm working on that I'd like to share, which is how do you give agency back to consumers in this technical space? So one thing I've been writing about, it's going to come out soon in a new book chapter, is around an Energy Star rating. And I came up with that because I went to buy a dishwasher 2 years ago, and I went into a big box store and I looked for the yellow sticker that basically showed me how much water the dishwasher was going to consume, how much electricity the dishwasher was going to consume, how durable it was going to be. In doing further research, I found that this is a collaboration between a variety of federal agencies that have come up with some standards, not necessarily enforcement standards, but standards on what consumers should expect when purchasing appliances. I actually think that we need to do something like that with algorithms. We're seeing this done in Germany and other places where we're seeing these labeling systems. But the argument that I'm making is not so much on just the way that this format looks, but what's behind it. First and foremost, we need, as everybody has said, technical cadence that's fair. We need to sort of get beyond the elusive understandings of technical cadence in the design of these models, bring together interdisciplinary work groups that actually push out those sensitive use cases where we know there's going to be a consequence. And we need to come up with ways to have better data quality. Right now, many of these models do not work because the data quality either overrepresents people of color or other vulnerable populations in the LGBTQ community, or it underrepresents them. And that has an impact because that data is not divorced from our society. So having that technical cadence in this framework I've been working on, I think is really important, including the data quality. I think it's also important that policymakers come in on the side of what are the predictions coming out of these models and where should they find ways to legislate or regulate. In my view, civil rights is one, but what about disclosures? Most consumers do not know that decisions are being made about them using algorithms. There is not any type of read the fine line that says this decision for you to buy a car because you think your credit is actually looks like this. This is an algorithm, and we need to be very transparent that people have algorithms that are positioning ads, exposing information to them around polling data, et cetera, because I think most of us don't understand what's in front of the veil. And I think what's most important is what Matt sort of insinuated, is we need consumer feedback loops. How do people come in and appeal the decision when technology fails to optimize their physical characteristics or their social circumstances? I'll give you a great example. I go on many panels and I constantly talk about facial recognition, not recognizing my face, when I change my hair, what lighting I'm in. First, you need to disclose that it's not going to be optimized for me. But second, you need to hear that from me. And you need to hear that before it hits market and it becomes something that misidentifies me, puts me in a prison or law enforcement office like the man in Detroit a few months ago. I sit there for 6 hours because the technology offers a grainy image and it's not very well in terms of its accuracy. We need to have these embedded consumer feedback loops so consumers can also be part of the agency and making these algorithms much more accurate. And in some cases, we may need policymakers to work alongside civil society organizations, as has been suggested, to ensure that when we're getting into health, housing, education, employment, financial services, areas, again, that have been litigated and mitigated for fairness, that we're ensuring that these models are not usurping our power away and essentially making us products versus producers in this economy. As you can tell, I'm like a Black Baptist preacher. This is really important to me because I really think that people don't understand what's behind the veil. We've all been sitting home for 2 years trying to figure out how to shop online, how to see our doctors online. As this data has been collected, we have opened up a firestorm for more information to be used against us in ways that surveil our market preferences, but also allow an entryway, as Nora has suggested, for misinformation and disinformation. Until we get this right, that there's reputational risk for companies that generate bad algorithms that cannot put that label on their products, and there's consumer harm that comes when we foreclose on opportunities for people to have first-class digital citizenship, we'll be back here next year talking about the same problem. And the 4 of us, 5 of us will keep writing the same reports. We really need some type of conversation from Congress, civil society, technologists, sociologists, philosophers, privacy experts, legal experts, to get to the core of those areas which we know have the most concerns for communities and let people know that this is happening.
Well, speaking of Congress, I mean, we have seen so many proposals coming out of Congress around transparency, and we've also seen them from other policymakers around the world, so not just in the United States. I'm wondering, Daphne, you speak to lawmakers and policymakers. Are they aware of the types of harms facing different user communities that we've been talking about today? And are they thinking about the role that transparency can play in helping to combat those harms?
I would say only very superficially. They're not deep in their thinking about what data we want as a transparency matter, as I talked about before, but they're also not deep in their thinking about who is being harmed and how within specific communities. And it's the same problem on Capitol Hill or inside of tech companies. Like, you don't know what you don't know. This is why you need diverse teams within platforms doing content moderation to try to reduce your blind spots. As Nicole points out, it's also why you need diversity, or maybe this is, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like the engineers building the algorithms, it depends, it's important who they are and what issues they are capable of spotting. So yeah, I think on Capitol Hill and in tech companies talking about transparency, what voices are or are not heard really shapes outcomes, and not that many voices get heard. And it's the governance question about getting information to platforms so they can do a better job has a lot of analogs to the questions we've had about real governance, on Capitol Hill or in state legislatures or at agencies all along, and how to get better information in front of them from a greater diversity of perspectives. What's hardest to spot, I think, always will be the least represented groups, and a conspicuous example, as Nora pointed out, is by language. Like, this is one of the things that I think was most important from Frances Haugen's revelations, is how speakers of non-major market languages not just are getting worse content moderation by human moderators, but also have totally different algorithms, because the data set to train the algorithms isn't big enough to do it right in Chechen or Malayalam or smaller language groups. So how do you correct for that? Harness the power of people who can see it, bring in the local NGOs who can see the fine-grained, really concrete problems that are happening and explain them. You'll never have enough tech employees inside the companies or staffers inside of governance to have that knowledge themselves. So you need a channel to kind of reach out into those capillaries of the system of who's seeing the more fine-grained stuff. Here's where maybe there's like a bright spot, that internet technologies are a plus. Nora talked about bringing more local groups into the FTC hearings and so forth. That used to mean flying to Washington, D.C. More and more, we have ways to interact in ways that are faster and cheaper and just sort of lighter weight, over Zoom. I testified to the ITC over Zoom this summer. That's a plus. That's digital technology doing what we all hoped it would do 20 years ago, and diversifying who gets to, speak truth to power or have their voice heard. And so, doubling down on that and harnessing those positives, I think, is one of the really important things here.
Thanks, Daphne. Well, we're running a little short on time, and I want to get to audience questions. So I'm going to ask just one more question to the panelists. And if you're in the audience and you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A button in your Zoom box. So to any of our panelists who want to talk about it, what do you see as some of the limits of transparency and empowering users? And on the other side of things, what do you see as some of the promise or some of the potential or creative solutions that you've seen tried and you want to see more of? So Matt, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, this question of how do you create sort of empowered users who can then speak in the context of the data that is perhaps available in some beautiful future world to them to advocate on behalf of themselves. And I think, there's two sort of jargony terms that I always come back to on this. The first is from the world of cybersecurity, security through obscurity. The idea that you can sort of hide away the thing that you hold most dear. As long as people don't know it's there or they can't figure out how to get to it, it's safe. I think that there's a lot of security through obscurity going on for the business model of these platforms. The second is weaponized boredom. I think I got this from that podcast, 99% Invisible. They're talking about terms of service. The idea is that if you can make something esoteric enough, like the terms of service that we all click through whenever we're installing a new app or signing up for a home loan or anything these days, if you can make it boring enough and timely enough and burdensome enough on somebody's life, they won't take the time or be able to navigate through to understand it and decide if they agree with it or not. And I think that's exactly what's happening with the things that we're calling algorithms these days. So the challenge that's in front of us is not just how do you create a new law that requires Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or whoever you want to pick to release all of their internal memos and all of their internal AI recipes and all of these things. The question is, how do you create a public, and in particular, in these most affected and most vulnerable and underserved communities with regards to the platforms, how do you get those people to be the most informed people about how these mechanics work in order to advocate for their needs? And, the traditional answer here is like media literacy or civics. And so, it may be that what we're talking about here is a combination of the need for aggressive regulatory intervention and renorming in terms of what we expect from products, and then aggressive consumer education. And when I say consumer education, I mean like K through 12, right? Like, wouldn't that be a thing if we were teaching our middle schoolers how algorithms work and what algorithmic bias is? That would be great. But we're not going to be able to get to it simply by publishing more data. And so I agree wholeheartedly with the point that Nicole was making on that front. And I think, the challenge isn't just antitrust. It isn't just transparency, and it isn't just making platforms that have safer colors with buttons on them. It's all three of those things together.
Thanks, Matt. I do want to turn to a question from the audience. So sorry to the rest of the panelists for not giving you a chance to answer that one, but we do have a question coming in from Twitter that is about anecdotal evidence versus actual evidence of systemic human rights violations. And the questioner asks, how can transparency help us understand the actual impact of technology on human rights beyond the anecdote? What kinds of transparency? Does anyone want to address that?
Well, I'll go in. I think as a researcher, and I like the question because I was just testifying for the NAIR, which is, I think, the National AI Research Initiative that's coming out of the White House. I think first and foremost, what we're seeing in the White House in terms of the recent release of a rights-based framework when it comes to these models, or the collection or the development and collection of research is much more inclusive and designed to look at these human rights and civil rights violations. Most importantly, we have to define it, right? And I think the person who asked the question is completely right. A lot of us get up and we talk about these anecdotal situations, but because of the opacity of the internet, it becomes very difficult for us to look at the internet in these cases where we know that there's a causal relationship between the two. Whether it's misinformation and voter interference, we still, Nora might agree with me, we still debate that 2016 data and the extent to which it had a huge effect or a non-huge effect on this. There are researchers, and I've just met some recently, that are trying to look at this weaponization and of data and algorithms to sort of trigger these types of disruptions in human rights. But I would just err on the side of sociologists. We just need more research. We need research that is not necessarily the regression analysis only or peer reviewed, but we need both peer reviewed research and pragmatic readers for people to understand these correlations better. And we need to open up this space to more social scientists that sit alongside technologists to better understand these human and civil rights violations. As a sociologist, some people ask, how did you get in this debate? Well, I get in this debate like many people on this event call here because we care about human and civil rights. But we've all had to carve our space in this domain in ways that I think, has come very late in the process as these models have become more sophisticated. So with regards to the question, we just need to have this research done. And if companies are not going to do it, this is a role, and I think, Caitlin's going back to your question, where Congress should be allocating money to places like the National Science Foundation and other places so that we can engage in this research and not be passed by when it comes to these types of questions. Because right now, there's not an equal distribution of money, research funding to help build better data quality and more inclusive data quality, in addition to looking at these issues straight on.
I would add, I think maybe, there's kind of this continuum between anecdotal accounts on the one hand, and then like the perfect data dump of everything from the platforms on the other. And there are interesting things in between, like the project Jillian York at EFF and some others were running for a while, gathering accounts by people who thought that they'd been mistreated on platforms and try to synthesize that into reports. Or I'm thinking of like the NYU Mozilla extension that, you know, scraped people's Facebook pages to gather information about electoral disinformation and ads. It's self-selecting who installed it, so it's not a perfect set, but it's better than anecdotal. And this conversation makes me think how analogous that is to projects putting apps on people's phones to report police abuse or to otherwise try to like quantify and track things that are going on in the world, again, in a way that's like not perfectly scientific because it's self-selecting, but it's better than anecdotal. And I feel like there's a lot of promise in more like modest and achievable and interesting data gathering experts over in that middle range.
Right, but that involves, Daphne, which is why I like what you mentioned in the NYU's work. It's a multiple methodological approach to this, which is a lot different than when this space opened up that was highly reserved for technologists. So that type of qualitative analysis is now seeping into these spaces, and to me, in the last 5 to 10 years that we haven't seen before. So hopefully we'll continue on that trajectory.
Great. Well, I love those examples, Daphne, because they're almost like user-generated transparency. So empowering users through transparency using transparency that is generated from users, maybe a potential other avenue to explore. Well, we are out of time, but I would like to thank Matt, Nora, Daphne, and Nicole so much for sharing your expertise with us and for having this conversation today, and also to all the audience for attending and watching. And please tune in tomorrow for more. Thank you so much, everyone.
Great. And just a final thank you and wrap up from me. We really appreciate you all joining for today's Future of Speech Online sessions. We'll be starting up again tomorrow at noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Central European Time with sessions